All right, so let's open it up. Hello.
Hi.
Hi there. We had the wrong number. We weren't getting in, so.
Oh, you came just in time. We just finished praying.
Yeah. Okay, great.
All right, so last week we started chapter 18, which is really a continuation from chapter 17, right? In chapter 17, the angel tells John, I'm going to tell you the end of, the great harlot of Babylon. But really chapter 17 is really talking about what is Babylon, what is this scarlet on top of this beast. In 18 is where we start getting the details, right? So we read the fact that, destruction comes in 1 hour in that great city, and people will mourn, and the kings that drank of her wrath, right, of her wine, will mourn after her, and the merchants will mourn, all right? And that's kind of where we stopped. But the main thing that we talked about is this is kind of like an amalgamated power, right? So this is a group of powers that really control everything, right? So they control kings, they control governments, they control the economies, right? They control money and transport and all of these things. And it claims like it's going to live forever, right? It proclaims that it's going to lead the world forever. And then God says, well, no, in 1 hour, you're going to be destroyed and your smoke will rise from, the fire and so on. What we're going to read is the continuation now. So last week, we finished off with these two verses here. So I'll read these two, and then that'll just be a springboard into the new verses. So verse 9, the kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance for fear of her torment, saying, alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. All right, so that's like the big boom, right? It's been destroyed. The world is going to marvel, right? But from a distance, they don't want to get too close. They don't want to suffer the same consequence. But there's this mourning and weeping and this judgment that fell in like 1 hour, or in other words, very, very quickly. All right. So using those two verses, let's go into the next section. The next three verses, I believe, are really important. They kind of sound kind of not very important, but I think it really shapes how we should read chapter 18. Does someone want to read verses 11 to 13?
And the merchants of the heart will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore. Merchandise of gold and silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen and purple, silk and scarlet, every kind of what?
Citron.
Citron, stones and pearls, fine linen and purple silk. Oh, sorry. Wood, every kind of object of ivory, every kind of object of precious wood, bronze, iron, and marble, and cinnamon and incense, fragrant or of what?
Oil and frankincense.
Of oil and frankincense, wine and oil, fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horse and chariots, and bodies and souls of men.
All right. So the big question about chapter 18 is always whether we're talking about something symbolic or something more literal. When you look at these three verses here, it really does sound literal, right? Because what John is listing out here is basically everything that used to be bought and sold back then, right? In those days, this was commerce. This was, the Toronto Stock Exchange, if you want to put it that way. It's very precise, very kind of, it's giving us the details, which kind of pushes away from the idea that this is just symbolic, right? Like this is a symbolic meaning. This really does give the impression that this power will be connected to trade, right? To money, to the economy, to you know, the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, and so on. Um, and it really is quite a list, right? And if you look at the end there, it even includes slavery, right? They're selling bodies and the souls of men. So it really is just everything that kind of used to be sold in those days. And so it's that idea that this power, right, this Babylon power, has its hand in everything, right? In every aspect of life, in every commerce and everything that's bought and sold. Because if you remember, if you go back to, I believe it's Revelation 14, with the, you know, when it makes that image of the beast, it talks about that only those that have the mark of the beast are able to buy and sell, right? So several times in the book of Revelation, it's made that connection that these evil powers, right? Whether it's the beast or the image of the beast, or you know, this prostitute woman or the scarlet beast, whatever, all of those evil powers that work for Satan, there's always kind of this connection to money and to buying and selling and to products and the commerce and so on. So when I read these verses, I really get the impression that this is literal. This is a power that really does control these things. Anyone have any comments on these three verses here? Any ideas or questions?
Yeah, I believe that that this is literal, but quite a few of the writers like Stefanovic and some others look at this and think it's spiritual.
Mm,
That is, it's a trade in slander and wickedness.
mm,
But I believe we're looking at, because remember the last church in the seven churches, it says that the people believe that they're rich
yeah.
and they don't need anything in the world
Mm,
and they have everything, you know. So it gives this fits in quite well in saying that commerce, it's a big thing at the ending of time with Babylon. And she is a great trader in the world.
mm-hmm.
And not only is she a great trader, but later on we'll see that she is also a deceiver. But here it says that the kings live luxuriously with her.
Yeah.
So, and later on it talks about the merchants
Mm-hmm.
trading with her. And so it does give me the same impression that it's literal. We're looking at a nation who has tremendous influence and also trades.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting here, and you mentioned it, there's two groups that mourn after this Babylon power, right? It's the kings who lived luxuriously through her, but it's also the merchants, right? It's also the merchants who, you know, would buy and sell with her, would make their money through that trading. Um, and so I think that's important to remember, because a lot of people, when they talk about Babylon, right? That's kind of a big word that's used a lot of times. Most people, when they talk about Babylon, their mind is very focused on just like a religious power, right? It just has a religious connotation to it. But in reading Revelation 17, chapter 18, and even a few other ones, frankly, you realize that it's bigger than that. It's not just a religion, right? This is a religion. It's a government. It's a superpower, right? It's something that really does have the ability to control everything. Um, when it talks about merchandise, what's interesting, and you have to remember, so John is seeing something that he can understand, right? So the things that he's looking at are the things that would be bought and sold in his day, right? Nowadays, the list would probably be very different, right? It'd probably have computers and phones and cars and who knows what. But the newest thing, the newest merchandise that really exists on this earth now is knowledge, is information, right? And so you could probably include this in here. This power, this superpower, doesn't just control physical goods, right? It doesn't just control cars and gold and silver and so on. Uh, Merchandise nowadays includes personal information. It includes the news. It includes, what's truth and what's fake and that's why, the world that we're living in, it's so hard to know the truth because all of it's being manipulated, right? Everything we watch in the news, everything that you hear from politicians, from whatever it is, right? Everything is being twisted and used by people to try to control others, right? To try to get a certain message out into the world. Um, and so I would actually include, you know, information in this line here, in this list of things, because that's what we're seeing in the world, right? Um, it's hard to know who to trust and what to do. And, you think about the pandemic and the vaccines and all, like the news keeps changing. Now they're talking about a third booster and, we still got to wear masks and you got to do this. And it gets so confusing um, that we don't know what's right and wrong anymore. And I think, well, the word Babylon means confusion, right? And I would totally say that this Babylon power is also influencing, what we see in the news today, what we hear from others and the internet and all of these things. All of that is being influenced by this Babylon power, right? By this superpower kind of that controls the world. Any other thoughts before we read the next couple of verses?
Yeah, I think Ezekiel chapter 27
Mm-hmm.
I'm
gives
just there.
an insight into the merchants and the trade. I think John must be picking up from Ezekiel. For
Mm-hmm.
example, in Ezekiel, I'm looking at just to pick out a few, I'm looking at the 12th verse. It says, Tarshish was your merchant because of your many luxury goods. They gave you silver, iron, tin, lead for your goods. Then he goes down, he says, Javan, Tubal, Meshach were your traders or merchants. Then he goes down to, for example, all the way down to, and I'm skipping over, there's to Garma, Dedan, Syria was your merchant. So these nations were called merchants. So when we look at the book of Revelation, and we're talking about merchants here,
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about nations trading with Babylon.
Yeah.
Because in the Old Testament, Babylon itself was a great trader.
Mm-hmm.
She traded in a lot of the goods, because it says the Euphrates River ran through the city of Babylon,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of the trade was done by sea. And so I think John is using maybe this particular chapter, because when you go down to, for example, let's say in verse 16, it talks about Syria. It says, they gave you for your wares emeralds, purple, embroidery, fine linen, corals, and rubies, and so on and so forth.
Very
so he's
similar, right?
using, literal items, a material that he trades in. And I think that, which gives me again this idea that it is. So we talk about
Literal.
merchants, and these are really nations that trading with Babylon.
Yeah, and really that's what it is, right? So, for instance, when you have these trade agreements, it's between governments, right? It's governments that create the system for trade. So, absolutely. Yeah. So I think there's a very strong push that this is literal. Um, you could try to make it, spiritual or um, but it almost complicates it. For me, this chapter is actually very simple. It's simply saying, what's the consequence when this superpower falls? How is the world going to react? And it's exactly this. There's mourning. People, well, and think about it. Imagine if all the markets in the world suddenly crashed. What would the nations do? They would cry and they would weep, and everyone would think it's the end of the world. And it's exactly what we're reading here, right? It's this economic crash, but it's connected to, and it always is, right? So the last economic crash, for instance, 2008, I believe it was, or I think we've had one since actually. But that was the housing market in the States, right? So the government made some rules that really went bad. And because the government screwed up, boom, the markets crashed, Same thing happened in China. China did a few things. It wasn't good for the economy, and the economy crashed. So it's always connected to the nations, right? The nations get hurt, the economy gets hurt. Well, even the pandemic, we saw the consequence of that, right? The pandemic and how it affected the economy. So that really does seem to be what we're seing here. So let's see what it keeps saying here. So
Was
Lynette, I know you mentioned.
Babylon was destroyed, and is it rebuilt?
Okay, so chapter 17, it makes it perfectly clear that Babylon, Babylon that's being mentioned, is not the literal Babylon, of where Iraq is today. This is a new power that kind of takes on that name. All right. So in the way that Babylon was like the big evil power against God's people, at the end, there's going to be a new big evil power that's against God's people. And it's called Babylon. All right. It's just called Babylon. All right. Can someone read verses 14 to 16?
The fruit that your soul,
Go ahead, honey. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Louise.
the fruit that your soul longed for has gone from you, and all the things which are rich and splendid have gone from you, and you shall find them no more at all. The merchant of these things who became rich by her will stand at a distance for fear of her torment, weeping and wailing, and saying, Alas, alas, that great city that was clothed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls.
Mhm. So this is very poetic. It's very similar to what we were reading when it talked about the kings of the earth, right? They kind of have that same reaction. They stay off at a distance because of fear, but they're wailing and weeping and so on. But again, in these few verses here, it kind of really doubles that emphasis of money, right? Of trade, of the fact that, you used to be this rich power, and now suddenly, because she was destroyed, you've lost your wealth as well, right? And what's interesting is during the days of John, for instance, during Old Testament, New Testament, the economies of the world weren't so closely connected, right? So, for instance, if Egypt were to collapse, right? Let's say they had a drought and they lost a lot of things and so on, it wouldn't affect the rest of the world, right? Because economies were very separate during the time of John and stuff. I guess Rome could be an exception because it was so large that it kind of had its fingers in everything. But in general, if a nation, crashed or had a bad time, the neighboring nations wouldn't care. It wasn't that important. But what we're reading here is the fall of one nation, right? The fall of this Babylon power affects the whole world, right? All the merchants, all the kings. And what's amazing about that is that's globalism, right? That's exactly what exists today. The way the world is set up now is if one country gets hurt, all the world suffers, right? So if China has a collapse, or if the US or even Canada, countries in Europe, Germany or France or whatever, for instance, when Italy isn't a superpower when it comes to the markets, but when Italy went bankrupt, it drove the whole world got dragged down, right? It affected Europe first, the EU, but because the EU got pushed down, the rest of the world got pushed down. So really, what's amazing here in chapter 18 is that John is talking about globalization before it even exists, right? What he's writing here theoretically shouldn't happen in his day. But it really does show us that John truly is looking into the future, right? He's looking into a future where all the countries are connected. And if one power goes down, everyone suffers, right? The whole world kind of suffers. So that's the one thing that I find really, really interesting, with these three verses here. But is there any questions or comments, anything you want to add to these three verses here?
And again, we have to remember that John is seeing things, and he's describing it based on his own experience in his culture. Yeah. And so we have to look at that as we interpret what he's writing here. So, of course, Babylon in the old days, in the Old Testament, was such a great nation.
Yeah.
and a great trader and the center of the entire world in those days. So we're looking at something similar
Yeah.
today. So I was using the reference.
Yeah, and again, it goes back to what we said earlier, which is Babylon isn't just any other country. Babylon is a superpower. This is, and that's why we kind of believe that it's even more than just one country. It's kind of, it probably has like a center, a head country that kind of connects, but this is more than one. This is kind of a group of countries working together. Because again, remember, when we go to chapter 17, that scarlet beast has, 10 horns, which are 10 kings and so on. We get this idea of these 10 kings working together, right? And that seems to be kind of what we're seeing here is this group superpower that exists close to the end, and then its fall, right? That happens in 1 hour. All right, let's keep reading then. Verses 17 and 18. Anybody want to take this one?
For in 1 hour such great riches came to nothing. Every shipmaster, all who traveled by ship, sailors, and as many as trade on the sea, stood at a distance and cried out when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, "What is like this great city?"
Mm-hmm. So we've gone through kind of 3 layers now, right? So we start with the kings wailing, then it kind of goes to the merchants wailing. Now it goes to like the ships and the sailors wailing, right? It's almost it's kind of funny because it's the sanctuary image in reverse, right? So when you read Revelation, John is taken into the holy place, God is there on his throne, and first the 4 living creatures worship him, and then the 24 elders worship, and then the angels that are there are worship, and then the all of heaven is worshiping, and then even the birds and the animals and everyone is kind of worshiping God together. You get this crescendo, right, happening of this worship of God gets bigger and bigger as you go through Revelation. In Revelation 18, it's almost the opposite, right? When this power dies, the big guys are wailing first, right? The kings, and then it's the merchants, then it's the sailors, and so it's similar but in reverse, right? It's this idea of instead of worshiping, they're crying, they're wailing because of what they've lost, and instead of the power getting bigger, the power kind of keeps getting smaller. But again, chapter 17, 18, very strong push of something physical because like Ken said, this is how they traded, right? Primarily through boats, right? They could carry a lot of things and take it to a different country, and yeah, the shipbuilders and the sailors, if there's nothing to trade, they're broke, right? There's no business. So it makes sense that they would be wailing, right, and crying as they see this superpower collapse around them because they realize that their own livelihood is also collapsed because of it. Any questions here or comments?
This is why, Pastor, they said bird is unclean and demons.
From which part? Which verse are you talking about?
I think it's in chapter 16 or 17. They mention about the birds.
Yeah, that's because
Plain birds.
it's specifically talking about the scavenger birds, right? The ones that pick at the dead flesh.
Okay.
They're unclean, right? Because when the people die, because again, remember, we have to look at this through their eyes. They used to have brutal battles, right, with swords and spears and arrows and blood all over the place. And when you could have 10,000 people die in a battle, it would take days to collect all those bodies and so on. And during that time, the scavenger birds would come out and they would start eating the dead soldiers, right? So that's the image that they have. And so when it talks about, the end times when the evil are judged and killed, they give that image, right? That even, the birds will come and peck at their flesh and so on. So it's just that imagery that John's trying to express. Anything else from these 2 verses here?
No?
It's kind of a lot of repetition, right? It's kind of it's repetition, but it's emphasizing, right? It keeps pinpointing this idea of money, commerce, trade, right? That luxuries and
Yes.
richness and stuff that exists on this earth, all of it connected to this superpower.
Mhm.
All right, let's keep going. Verses 19 and 20.
They threw dust on their heads and cried out, weeping and wailing and saying, at last, that great city in which all who had ships on the sea became rich by her wealth. For in 1 hour she is made desolate. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her.
All right, so verse 19 is again very similar, repetition. You'll notice that it says that her destruction comes in 1 hour. I think this is like the
1 hour.
fourth time
Yeah.
that it's repeated this. It really emphasizes, when it least expects it, when it reaches the height of its power. Because if you remember some earlier verses, the woman is saying, oh, I'm going to live forever. I don't need anyone. And, I'm this huge power and so on. And then, in 1 hour. So it's really emphasizing that quickness of how quickly she's going to fall. But in verse
Would
20,
you
we get
say,
different.
oh,
Yeah, go ahead, Yvonne. Go ahead.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say in verse 19, would you say that this is kind of telling us when Jesus comes, what it will be like?
I think so, right? We know the world is going to be angry, right? Because everything is going to be collapsing around them, right? And the plagues are going to come, and the economy is going to crash, and governments are going to fall, and all of these things. And we know that God's people are going to be kind of picked at, right? As kind of the reason for why all of this is happening. And yeah, I think it's going to be mayhem, right? I think it's going to be just kind of chaos everywhere. Um, but that's what's interesting about verse 20, because up until verse 19, everyone is weeping and crying, and but that's because it's focusing on the world, right? It's focusing on those that aren't with God. In verse 20, it flips the script, right? And it's now looking at heaven, and it's looking at the saints, it's looking at God's people, and it's saying rejoice, right? So while the rest of the world is crying, now it's your time to be happy. And this is really important because in a lot of books of the Bible, Lamentations is a perfect example. There's always this kind of question, right? You especially within the wisdom books, a lot of people ask the question, why is it that the bad prosper and God's people seem to always suffer, right? Seem to always be at the bottom and seem to, never win and so on. And it's kind of how we see the world, right? It seems like the more evil you are, the more crooked you are, the richer you become, right? But what these verses are saying is, listen, the day will come where it will flip, right? So those greedy people, the liars, the stealers, those that did all of these bad things, they're going to be the ones crying and wailing and in despair, throwing dust on their heads. And it's going to be God's people, the ones that have always been trampled on, right? The ones that have always been blamed for everything. They're going to be the ones rejoicing. They're going to be the ones celebrating, because finally God is proclaiming justice, right? God is setting the record straight. And so that really is the big push there of verse 20. It's this, don't think the whole world is crying. God's people will be able to rejoice during this time. Any comments, questions?
I think we have to remember too that Babylon has a tremendous influence over the world because of this cup of her indignation. So she has influenced the world not only with whatever is in the cup, but with her trade and her wealth and luxury. And that now that the merchants and the nations have, because she is being destroyed, they've lost this trade. And so the richness and all the luxury that they had, they are mourning. It's all gone. Everything that they depended on, that was a foundation of their existence, is gone. So they're mourning, they're left at a loss. What will they do? You know, it's all gone.
Yeah.
And I think the world in the last days will be one in which there is a focus on material goods and commerce, because remember it says that this particular nation will make this image to the beast, and you can't buy and sell unless you have the mark. And so commerce becomes very important, and it is a very a grave influence upon many of the people around the world, or many nations. And one of these things that we have to be very careful with. We don't get so involved that commerce and material things become like a god to us.
Which is a big problem in today's world, right? I mean, we're completely materialistic now. And it's interesting. I was just reading, I think it was yesterday, that because of the pandemic, because people were kind of shut in so long, they've even become more materialistic now, right? There's this big drive. I need to go buy something, right? I need to go to the mall and just buy something, just to get out, kind of a thing. And it seems to be where people are going to find happiness, right? They think that if I buy stuff now, it'll make me feel better. The problem is it's not about the stuff that we have, right? That's not where joy comes from. But again, part of this lie, right? Part of this confusion that Babylon brings in is that lie, which is no, you need to buy to be happy, right? The richer you are, the more things you have, the bigger your car or your home or pool or whatever it is, that's where your joy is going to come from. And it's just not true, right? And then this will happen, and suddenly all of that is taken away, and people realize just how poor they are, right? Going back to like the seventh church, for instance, materially rich, but God is saying, you guys are poor, you guys are naked, you guys are desolate, right? That's the world we're living in. The world has never been richer, and yet it's never been poorer, right? Morality wise and just happiness wise and so on. People are miserable. People are, stressed out, not sleeping, not content. And so it's exactly what we're living in today. Absolutely. All right, let's keep going. Verses 21 and 22. Does someone want to read this?
Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, "Thus with violence the great city Babylon shall be thrown down and shall not be found any more. The sound of harpists, musicians, flutists, and trumpeters shall not be heard in you anymore. No craftsman of any craft shall be found in you anymore, and the sound of a millstone shall not be heard in you anymore."
So what do you think about these verses here? It's a slight change now, right? So it's not talking about how the outside world is reacting. Now it's talking about what is it like inside Babylon, right? And we see a lot of the luxuries, right? So it has music, it's got a lot of instruments, it's got a lot of craftsmen, right? It's full of art and opulence, and the millstone obviously represents grain and food and wheat, and so all of these luxury things, right? Abundance and so on. And what the angel is saying is, all of that's going to disappear, right? All of these riches, all of these things that people look at and are like, oh, I wish I could live like that, right? I wish, I could be rich and happy like, like that place. And then it's all going to disappear. No more music, no more, food, no more art and things like that. It's a powerful image. You can really see it when John explains it. Any thoughts here on these two verses?
It's very sad.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, what to me sounds very interesting is these references like the sound of harpists and musicians and flutists are not heard in you anymore, so that she's now come to an end. these things are not there that flourish in the past, all come to an end. So Babylon is destroyed. But what is interesting is this reminds me of when the devil brought Jesus to the top of the mountain or the pinnacle and says, look at all the worlds. I will give you all of the worlds if you will worship me.
Just worship, yeah.
Yeah. And Jesus says, it's written, you should only worship God. So in the book of Revelation, God is reminding us of who is more important than the goods and all the material things in the world, the luxury and these things. And he's telling us too that the things to come in the future, he is opening and revealing to us so that we will not be unawares when they come about.
Yeah.
Nor will we be neglectful of knowing who has opened these things so that we can have this confidence in him, because, God has told us of all these things that happen in the future. And now that we see them actually coming about right before our eyes, we now realize that God is a God of truth and he does see the future, and we can trust him because these things that he tells us about and why Babylon is experiencing this tragedy in her life is because they turn to the material things to worship as a God and neglected to worship the God who created all things. And I think the book of Revelation is trying to remind us and tell us that God is revealing who he really is in the book of Revelation. And he's giving a picture of us, to what we should do, and not follow Babylon, who has made all the world drink the wine of her fornication, but we stick to what God has taught us and the counsels we have given through the life of Christ. And we need to make a comparison, and we need to stick close to what Jesus has told us and how he lived.
I just find that it's strange that they have used music and the instruments in this, because a lot of the harpists and the trumpeters and the musicians, they were making it sing to God, in their worship. So I find it very difficult to associate this part of it with the bad things that's going to happen.
But I mean, I think, when you look at Daniel, for instance, you see how music, like Nebuchadnezzar, uses these instruments to say, when you hear this, worship the statue and so on. And the idea that, again, everything that God makes that's good, Satan finds a way of corrupting it, right? Of making it evil. And, to be honest, there's very few things that are more corrupting to a person's mind than music and movies and, like the media and so on. It's very, very powerful, right? The way that it affects you, the way that it changes your emotions and the way you think and the way you feel. And so, I don't know, I think it actually makes kind of sense that John would kind of pinpoint at this, or God would show this part of it, that, again, this power also has that part to it, right? Which is media, music, and entertainment, and how it uses that to cause creation and strife and so on. But one day that will end, right? One day the streets will be quiet. It kind of reminds me, when you look at some of the disasters, right? You look at something like Haiti and things like that, when a natural disaster goes through. These are cities full of music, full of life, and then in 1 second to the next, everything's silent, right? Everything's gone dead. Everything, there's just destruction and crying, and that's kind of the image that I get. It's this busy, living city, and then all of a sudden, just quiet, just crying, right? Just darkness and so on. That seems to be the image that John is seeing here, right? This very drastic, powerful, living, bright and noisy to smoke kind of a thing.
So it's not really a downgrade of these musical instruments that are used in the form of worship, but the next two verses will tell us that. What it is saying is you're not hearing any more of these because Babylon has come to an end.
Yeah.
So all the excitement and the frivolity and all the things that they used to do, marriage and everything else, is no more. She's come to an end.
Yeah.
These things are not there anymore.
Anyone else on anything on these 2 verses here? I think we have 2 more verses for this chapter. Let's see. Yeah, let's read the last 2 verses, and then we can kind of do a recap of the whole chapter. Anyone want to read these 2?
And the light of a lamp shall not shine in you anymore, and the voice of bridegroom and bride shall not be heard in you anymore. For your merchants were the great men of the earth. For by her sorcery all the nations were deceived, and in her was found the blood of prophets and saints, and of all who were slain on the earth. So even the voice of bride and bridegroom is not there anymore. Like the instruments, everything has come to an end. It's
Everyday living is all done.
right. Everyday living, as Pam says, is all gone.
Yeah.
You know, she sunk. She's like a rock thrown into the sea. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the end.
Which is very similar to, remember what Jesus says in Matthew, where he says, you know, when the end comes, people are going to be marrying and giving in marriage, and people are going to be living their life. And then all of a sudden, boom, right? Like everything changes, right? There's this drastic event. And that seems to be what we're reading here, right? So life, you know, life is normal in brackets, because I don't know what normal is anymore with everything that's going on. But people find a way of continuing living, right? Of still buying and selling and working and marrying and having kids and so on. But with this event, it's so drastic, it's so large that everything stops, right? And it's a worldwide event, even though it's, you know, this city or whatever that's destroyed. The whole world really goes silent, right? Like the whole world is shocked and just mournful at what's been lost, right? At the fact that, okay, the world's changed now. And verse 24 kind of says it all, right? Because it is a brutal chapter, right? It's very negative. But in verse 24 it says, and in her was found the blood of prophets and saints and all of those who were slain on the earth. So even as bad as it is, it's justice, right? It's not vengeance. It's not God going overboard. This is simply the woman receiving the punishment that she's built up throughout the years, right? God is finally allowing her reward to come down, right? And it's huge. It's huge.
God is just saying enough is enough.
Says here, ironically, the merchants weep not so much for Babylon, Rome, but for the lost markets.
Yeah, so they really don't care about the power, right? Babylon. They care about the money that they're losing, right? Like, where am I going to sell my stuff now, right? Where am I going to make my money now? And to be honest, you know, when we had the second war on Iraq, right? The second, what do they call it? The Gulf War. When they bombed and ended the war, the only thing the US cared about was, okay, where's the oil? You know, we have to protect the oil. We have to protect commerce. You know, they didn't care about all the dead soldiers or civilians or, you know, there was a Canadian reporter that got stuck in Iraq when the bombings happened. And then he had to stay in his house for, I think, a week before he was able to really get out the streets. And he took his camcorder and he went to government buildings, he went to schools, he went to hospitals, and he shows it and he says there's no soldiers here. You know, you just see people running in, stealing X-ray machines and crazy things like that. And he was asking his driver, he's like, where's all the American soldiers? You know, where are they? And he's like, oh, I'll show you. And he drove him down to the oil fields, and it was just, you know, the whole army right there. It's the only thing the U.S. was protecting, not the people. You know, they didn't care about Iraq. They cared about commerce. They cared about the money that Iraq had, right? And that's kind of what we're reading here. You know, they don't care about Babylon. They care about the money that Babylon was giving them, right? The luxury and the all of that stuff. Unfortunately, that's human nature. You know, that's really what we're seeing here. Um, it's just humans being humans, unfortunately. Any final thoughts in terms of Revelation 18? Kind of the whole chapter as a whole. Anything that you want to add to it, or?
Well, I think one of the things that it says, and Lynette was asking about the birds and the demons, is it begins with Babylon of itself will be filled with demons,
Mm-hmm.
you know, foul
Mm-hmm.
spirits and demons. So that's something, you know, it's strange that it becomes so convinced to follow these demons and to do what the demons are saying.
Yeah.
And then it goes on to, it uses the same, whatever has influenced her, she is influencing the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is following until at one point they will find that they were very deceived. But this gives a good picture if this is really literal, and I believe it is. We can really pinpoint who this great Babylon is. Because she's not only great Babylon, the great city, she's also a deceiver. And when we go back to Revelation 13, we know who the deceiver is. And she's a false prophet also. And so we keep these in mind, and this whole business of the ending of time becomes kind of simple. It's not as complicated as we thought.
Yeah.
Even though they're using this animal with 7 heads and 10 horns is now written by this great harlot called Babylon. When you put all together, as I said, John is using the animal picture to represent Nebuchadnezzar's image. It's the same, you know, because we will find that this beast with Babylon is thrown into the lake of fire eventually. And the world, Nebuchadnezzar's image is also destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
So the picture painted seems to see that we as human beings, or the kings, believe that their empire will last until the ending of time, as in the case of Nebuchadnezzar. And God is saying, no, my kingdom will come up at the end and it'll last forever.
Yeah.
And so the kingdom that will last forever is the one I want to be in, not the one that will be temporary.
Yeah.
So this is the one I'm siding with.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely right.
I think it's for me, I think it's telling us that we shouldn't put our eyes on the things of the earth.
Yeah.
We should prepare ourselves to God, prepare our hearts, and not concentrate on what's going on in the world.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. This whole chapter has basically been telling us, you know, if your life is money, you know, if your life is just trying to get as rich as you can, and then if that's the focus of your life, this is your end. You're gonna end up crying, right? You're gonna end up wailing and realizing that you've lost everything. You have nothing, right? That's really the message that we're seeing here.
Yeah.
The only people rejoicing in this chapter are the saints, are those that have put their trust in God, who, like Ken just said, you know, their empire is God, right? Is heaven. That's their nationality. I'm a Christian. I'm a son of God, right? That has to be the key. That has to be the focus of your life. It's not, you know, I'm American or I'm Canadian or I'm this and that. I own this business or I own that business. All of these things of the earth, they're all going to burn. Everything, you know, everything on this planet's going to burn. The only thing that's going to last forever is the kingdom of God. That's it. The only thing and that's why Jesus says, you know, don't store up treasures here on earth, because you're going to lose it. The only treasure worth storing is the treasures in heaven. You know, chapter 18, I think, is a very strong, you know, pointing, you know, message of that. Anyone else? Any final thoughts before we move on to prayers?
So the book of Revelation to me is, I mean, there are all kinds of things that happen in the future. There's all these events and so on. But to me, I see God as a merciful, gracious God, revealing through the book of Revelation who he really is or what he's like. And it is not a destructive God who wants to mete out punishment because we've been misbehaving. So I see God as one writer says, that God is revealed, and he is the revealer. He is revealed, but he's also the revealer in the book of Revelation.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And again, just the first verse in Revelation, right? This is the revelation of Jesus Christ, right?
Right.
And we have to always remember that this is showing us who God is, what is like, you know. He's a loving God. He's a just God, right? And one day he's got to put on that hat. He's got to be the judge. And it's not what makes him happy. Though at the same time, I think there is a part joy there because it's the end, right? There's no more suffering after this. I'm fixing the problem once and for all, and that's important, you know. Because I'll be honest, the last thing I would want is to live forever on this planet, you know, the way that this place
So
is.
good.
That's not my version of heaven. So it needs to be fixed, right? There needs to be a solution to sin, to pain, to death. Then we can truly start living, right? Then we can truly experience the life that God wants us to live. Yeah.
But notice how wickedness destroys itself, and God doesn't have to do the destruction, because in the case of Babylon, who confronts God, Babylon is destroyed by the friends that are influenced in made.
Yeah.
They're the ones that turn around. So it seems as though God is warning us, and he's telling us that the evil will be destroyed by itself. He doesn't even have to do that. For example, Satan, it says the power from within Satan destroys him.
Yeah.
See? And in the case of Babylon and the world, it left itself, evil will destroy itself.
Yeah. And that's what scientists even tell us, right? The way we're going, we're going to kill ourselves, right? Humanity will destroy this planet. And frankly, we've done a pretty good job up till now, right? Think of all the pollution. I was up north just a few days ago, and you know what? When you're just out in nature, it's so beautiful, right? Like it's amazing how things just grow, right? It's not like someone's planting or whatever. They just grow, and yet it works so beautifully. You look at it, and it just looks like a painting. But the closer you get to where people are, it just gets uglier and uglier, right? We're not good at taking care of things, right? So yeah, it's it's what God is showing us.
So much for being husbandmen.
Yeah. Well, if we hadn't have sinned, I think we would have done a good job. But unfortunately, with sin, it just becomes impossible, right? Because we have greed, we have ego, we have people, just thinking about themselves, and this is the consequence. This is what happens. All right, let's have some time for prayer. Let me stop recording here.